Is the R33 GTR really the worst GTR to exist? The R33 is the successor to the R32 GTR, a car that broke the auto industry and solidified Japan as a superpower in technology and automotive prowess. It is also the predecessor to the R34, which I don't think needs much explaining. So does the R33 GTR really deserve to be the black sheep of the GTR family, or is this another example of the internet gatekeeping something truly spectacular? If you spend some time on the internet, you'll quickly find a large group of people who have a particular distaste for the R33, all the while the R32 and the R34 are praised like gods at a near cult-like level. From face value, it's easy to see why that is. At least from the American perspective, the R32 was the first child who got all the attention because there was nothing else like it, and respect is due for the accolades it received. It also had a rebirth in popularity once they were legal to import to the US. The R34 was plastered all over television screens, both in video games and a particularly famous movie franchise, solidifying the R34 as the greatest of all time. That leaves the R33 to being the awkward middle child. But was it really the awkward middle child, or the proper evolutionary step in the GTR lineage? So one thing people will drone on about with the R33 GTR is that it's softer and heavier, and it is heavier though, and by 100 kilograms. In freedom units, that's about 220 pounds. But did it get heavier for good reason? There are two major culprits to the weight increase. The chassis rigidity was increased by 150% over the R32, and the wheelbase was lengthened, and for good reason. While the R32 was targeted at Group A racing, the R33 was targeted at some higher speed classes, one of them being this little French race you may have heard of called the 24 Hours of Le Mans. As you could imagine, the 24 Hours of Le Mans is a very high-speed race, and lengthening the wheelbase adds another level of stability to the car. So even though it did increase in weight, the weight distribution improved. The R32 was a 60-40 split front to rear, while this R33 is a 55-45 split, and even better, there's a lower polar moment of inertia with this new weight distribution. Some of you may be asking, what's the polar moment of inertia? The polar moment of inertia refers to where the weight is relative to the center of the car. The further the weight is from the center is considered a high polar moment, and the closer the weight is to the center of the vehicle is considered a low polar moment. Generally speaking, the lower the polar moment of inertia is, the better a car handles. You can have a car with a 50-50 weight distribution, but 50% of it could be over the front bumper and the other 50% could be hanging over the rear bumper, which would give the car poor handling tendencies. So to test this out, you can actually do this at home. Get some sort of weight and hold it close to you and just kind of twist and rotate with it. Be careful not to hurt your back. There's your disclaimer. And you can feel it's really easy to rotate around. Now if I push that weight out further and I try to rotate around like this, you notice it's a lot harder to. The same applies to cars. And you know, driving this car, you can tell there is a little bit more of an eagerness for the car to rotate. A little easier turn in and a little more rotation from the rear end, which is ample. It proves that that lower polar moment of inertia is noticeable. One example of this is the engineers brought the fuel tank closer to the center of the car. It's now below the rear seats instead of below the trunk like in the R32. So even though it's heavier, it uses the weight better. What's the saying again? It's not about the size of the boat, but the way the boat effectively uses weight distribution to its advantage. I feel like another thing people don't like about the R33 is the styling, and you know, you're entitled to your opinion on that stuff, that's for sure. There's no arguing that. That is purely subjective. Me personally, I really like the styling of the R33 more than the 32, just for nostalgia reasons. But don't let that fool you. It's not just styling. There's a lot of aerodynamics going on behind the scenes with this design. Remember how we mentioned the car was aimed at high-speed racing? Yeah, the engineers didn't stop at weight distribution. They invested a ton of R&D into aerodynamics as well. Two major changes to note is the change in coefficient of drag and coefficient of lift. Before we nerd out on a bunch of numbers, let's talk about what the coefficient of drag is and what the coefficient of lift really is. And one good way to explain it is, imagine you're driving and you stick your hand out. And when you stick your hand out while you're driving, the wind kind of pulls back on it because you have your hand in a palm facing the wind. Now if you're to turn your hand like this, and it cuts through the air a lot better, that's the coefficient of drag. A much lower number is considered much better because it cuts through the air better. So high coefficient of drag is this, low coefficient is like this. Now the coefficient of lift is how much the car wants to lift up from the air going underneath it. Airplanes like a high coefficient of lift. Cars, not so much.
See them. Here we go. Oh my God, the Mercedes has taken off. That's Peter Dumbreck at the wheel of the number 5 Mercedes.
The R32 has a coefficient of drag of 0.40, which isn't that good. A 2004 Dodge Durango has a coefficient of drag of 0.39. The R33, on the other hand, made it down to a 0.35, which is leaps and bounds better than the R32, especially considering it still has the same exterior design philosophy. The coefficient of lift in the front dropped from 0.20 to 0.09. That is a massive reduction. Let's also add that there's an emphasis on cooling when it came to the front end design, really focusing on getting airflow into the radiator and other areas that needed cooling. Now don't take this like I'm talking poorly about the R32 GTR. What the R32 has done in the automotive landscape is monumental, and it deserves all the respect it can garner. But what I do want to say though is the R33 has made leaps and bounds of improvements over the R32. Okay, but what about the powertrain? Both cars are rated at 276 horsepower. While yes, that is true, we're still in the Japanese Gentleman Agreement era of horsepower ratings, so those power numbers may not be reflective to what's actually happening behind the scenes. The R33 uses a 16-bit computer instead of an 8-bit computer, so the factory programming is a bit more refined. It still has a 5-speed transmission that uses the same gear ratios as the R32, the only difference is the strength has been improved. It still uses an RB26 like the R32, and the only notable changes are some reliability improvements, which some later year model R32s already had. The Atessa ETS system has been improved upon, but just mildly, and that is due to better sensing equipment, better software, better computing power. So it really doesn't seem like a big step forward in terms of powertrain. That is until you realize testing shows the R32 did a 0 to 60 at 5.6 seconds, and the R33 does it in 5.3. Even though the R33 has a weight handicap of 220 pounds, tell me, how did it go faster in a straight line? Talking about the power band in this car might be a moot point though when you start to modify though, because honestly when you start modifying a car, the sky's the limit and you can manipulate the power band however you want. You go to a big single turbo, you can do other twin turbos, you can delete the turbos and go full NA, you can change it up however you want. But I will say though, this RB26 is just, it's really interesting. It, like the last video, it kind of builds boost quickly at 3,000, but it doesn't build a lot. So you kind of hit this wall, and then once you get to 4,000, it really kicks in and takes off. It really rocket ships out, and that's really a characteristic of the twin turbo setup. Now, I will say though, these stock turbos are way more responsive. They are just like response monsters, just right out of the corner, right into boost. Oh yeah. So with all these points stacked up, it really can't be that much of an improvement, right? Wrong. Even though the car is bigger, heavier, and softer, just like me after finishing my undergrad, the R33 managed to shave 21 seconds from the R32's Nürburgring lap record, from an 8:22 to an 8:01. 8:01, Salt Lake represent! This also gave the R33 the production car record at the time. Nissan came back a few years later with a V-Spec and brought the car down to a 7:59 lap time. The first production car to break the 8-minute barrier. I think we've driven the point far enough that the R33 is leaps and bounds improvements over the R32. And we can nerd out all day and all the technical changes and all kinds of stuff. We can really make this video an hour long if we want to. We can talk about the switch from the I-style control arms to the A-arms in the front and changing, you know, mechanical grip and all that stuff. But we're not going to get into that anymore. There's a lot of internet stuff. If you really want to dig into it, we can in another video. But today, I think we got the big bullet points out of the way. How does this car feel? What does it feel like to me as the driver? What am I feeling, what am I seeing, and what am I enjoying and disliking about this car? For this part of the video, I'm going to be heavily comparing to the R32 GTR. If you want to see my car review on the R32, I will have a link in the description below. One thing I can tell you comparing this car to the R32 is the R33 is a lot more refined and comfortable. Now the interior is a nicer place to be, but it's not a major upgrade, it's just a healthy upgrade. But the car feels more stable at high speeds, and it doesn't feel like it wears you out as much. When I spent a day with an R32, I felt kind of exhausted by the end of the day. I had a really good time, I had a lot of fun, and I was just tired at the end of the day. Where this car, I feel like I could drive it to Vegas and not be tired. I feel energized still. It doesn't wear me out as much. You do lose a little bit of that visceral feeling though. So it's a minor trade-off. You lose a little bit of that viscerality, if that is a word, in exchange for more comfort and more confidence in the car. I would rather take this car across country than an R32. And I just want to make a testament to the quality of this car and the build quality overall. This thing is near immaculate. It is such a clean example of an R33. It really feels like I teleported back to 1995 and drove this car off the showroom floor. I can only say there's honestly just some minor, like tiny little nicks and stuff. This car feels like a 9.5 out of 10 condition, which is impressive for a 27-year-old car. It kind of goes to show like the build quality and how well it's been taken care of, honestly. It's really impressive. Everything in here is just so nice. I was actually really terrified to drive this car just because of how nice it is. It's so nice. It's like the paint's super glossy and looks really, really good. The interior is just like, it looks better than most of my car's interiors. And this thing has 180,000 something kilometers on it. It's just like, my mind is blown, like just with this quality. And then you drive it, and you don't feel like you're driving a car from the 90s as ratty and partially death trap-ish. This thing feels like a car from the late 2000s, how well bolted together it is, how confident I feel driving it at limit. Chef's kiss, good soup, good soup. I genuinely feel you can't go wrong with either car, but there are some key elements here that will maximize your experience. Do you want a more visceral, raw experience, one where you plan ahead to take your R32 out for a drive on your favorite driving road and occasionally drive it to work or run errands in it? Or do you want something you can use more on the regular? The R33 is more comfortable, it doesn't wear you out as much, plus it's better at high-speed driving, making it a better choice for long drives and highway drives. But each drive may not be as memorable as the engagement from the R32. That's not to say the R33 isn't engaging and isn't memorable, because it is. There is a spectrum ranging from raw aggression to refinement. Depending on what you like better determines which R chassis suits you best. Now, you may have noticed I haven't really compared it to the R34 that much, and it's really for the simple fact that I've never driven an R34. Got one in Utah, hit me up. Anyway, it goes to say though that to go from 32 to 34, the 33 had to happen. It is the proper evolutionary step to get to that coveted R34. So a lot of respect is due to the R33, and for example, the Nürburgring lap times are a good example if you don't believe me. The R32 did an 8:22 lap time at the Nürburgring. The R33 did an 8:01, not only shaving 21 seconds off, but also becoming the world's fastest production car on the Nürburgring at the time. Now, the R34 went down to a 7:52, which was still a big cut in time, but not as big as the R32's cut. So, I would say, with that said, there is a lot of respect that needs to be given to this car. It does not deserve to be the black sheep of the GTR family. When it comes to GTRs, the R33 is a home run. It oozes the same DNA as the R32 and offers a near identical experience with some improvements all around. I can go on speaking praises to this car all day, but the simplest way I can describe my experience is like so. I walked away from the R32 thinking I could see myself owning one of these one day. I walked away from the R33 saying I need to own one of these one day. It truly is an excellent car and a proper evolutionary step in the GTR lineage. I guess we'll need to film a review on the R34 next to really finish the trilogy.